Okay, so a new study has come out that is showing that trans teens attempt suicide in states that have passed anti-trans laws, which should come as a surprise to anyone who actually cares about trans people. But there are plenty of people, and I've had a couple of conversations online, where people are convinced, they refuse to accept that just the fact of being trans isn't good enough to commit suicide. That they think that they're mentally unstable, they're mentally ill, or something. And it's obviously because they have this idea of themselves that they're good, decent people who would never, ever do something that would push someone into committing suicide. When the reality is that, yeah, your rhetoric and your actions do push people to suicide. Hell, the same person can't understand how come their kids don't want to talk to them. And I don't know the situation. I have no idea what they said or did that caused this. But just the idea that just apologizing for having shortcomings isn't enough to get kids to enter a toxic situation again. It's like, oh, my parents apologized. Yeah, that's what abusers do. And she did specify abuse as a reason for, kids cutting off their parents. But she put abuse and sexual. And I swear that's how she phrased it. Okay, are you saying just sexual abuse is abuse? I have no idea. Maybe she's meaning physical or sexual abuse, but somehow mental abuse is not considered abuse in her world. I don't know. But anyway, and I will emphasize this conversation did not happen on this platform, and definitely not on my channel. But I figured that if there's one or two people who insist on this line of reasoning, there will be more. So now we have a study proving what those of us who are either in the LGBT plus community, trans ourselves, and no, I'm not trans, but trans ourselves. Because yes, whenever I do a pro-trans video, I get people assuming I'm trans. Because apparently in their world, allyship doesn't exist. But allies, people of the LGBT plus community, this is something that they expected and knew was going to happen. This is not going to be news to any of us. But for those who insist on living in their little bubble where treating trans people like they shouldn't exist somehow miraculously isn't the cause of trans people attempting suicide. Which I do not know how that tracks in your head. I mean, you treat someone like absolute dirt and you're surprised that they don't think of themselves as dirt and want to off themselves? I just do not understand how that line of reasoning works. But the ego defense mechanism is strong with these people because they, like I said, they just can't accept that they might actually be trash human beings who are pushing people to harm themselves rather than the good, decent lollipops and unicorns that they see themselves, that world that they see themselves in, and that they're absolutely perfect people. And obviously the problem is with everyone else. So I don't I don't know if this video will actually change their minds, because, I mean, you have to be quite the narcissist to think that your shit doesn't stink. And even if it does, that somehow your transgressions should be forgivable because you're not a bad person, even though you know, espouse horrible, horrible freaking things. You know, how many times how many shots do you have to be given before you admit that you suck as a person? But anyway, let's get to the article. And it's titled, More Trans Teens Attempted Suicide After States Passed Anti-Trans Laws, a Study Shows. Which, again, no surprise to anyone who's actually paying attention. Alright. States that passed anti-transgender laws aimed at minors saw suicide attempts by transgender and gender nonconforming teenagers increase by as much as 72% in the following years, a new study by the Trevor Project says. Now, about the gender nonconforming teenagers, I actually saw this story on, I think it was on Threads, where this boy went into the bathroom. I don't remember how old he was. I think he was like 6. He was a little kid, but he has long hair. Now, anyone who grew up starting in the, 60s maybe, long hair on boys is fine. Nobody has a problem with that. All of a sudden, we have transvestigators everywhere who are trying to play gotcha with things like hair. Because the father heard the little boy yell, "I'm a boy," when this old man tried to shoo him out of a bathroom. I think it was in a McDonald's. Because, obviously, if he has long hair, he must be a girl. First off, okay, so a little girl ended up in the wrong bathroom. What's the big deal? Are you saying that as a man you couldn't help yourself, and if a little girl were to run into the men's bathroom that you would assault her? I fail to see why that's a big deal, but the point is, he was shooing this little boy out simply because he has long hair. Now, I had a nephew with long hair, and, people used to think that he was a girl, and he had to always correct them. So, that's a thing. This assumption that long hair must mean girl, short hair must mean boy. And no, that's not it. I mean, I just don't see why that's a thing anymore. There are short hairstyles just for girls, pixie cuts. I'm sorry, how is that a boy haircut? It's not. And boys can have long hair. It's perfectly fine. So this idea that we're going to peg you, and that's why I bring it up, because of the gender nonconforming thing. Because gender nonconforming doesn't necessarily have to mean that you identify as non-binary. It doesn't have to be that you're androgynous even. It just means you're living your life. He said he's a boy. He just happens to like long hair. So what? I fail to see the problem. He goes to the bathroom he identifies as, and how he was born. I've heard of kids who will actually pull their pants down to show the parts that they have, just to prove that they are who they say they are, to nosy fucking adults, because they seem to think that boys should look one way and girls should look another way. Just let them be. If kids want to have, if girls want to have short hair, if boys want to have long hair, fine. What's the problem? Anyway, moving on. The peer-reviewed study published Thursday in the journal Nature Human Behavior looked at survey data from young people in 19 states comparing rates of suicide attempts before and after bans passed. Over the past few years, dozens of states have passed laws affecting how transgender young people do things like play sports, go to the bathroom at school, and access gender-affirming medical care. And I just find it wild that cis people accessing gender-affirming care, nobody bats an eye. But if a trans student does it, all hell breaks loose. Anyway, the study's findings are not theoretical for some families. Well, I'm sure. You know, my child is dead, Kentucky Senator Karen Berg said at the State House during the debate over that state's anti-trans bill in February of 2023. Her transgender son had died by suicide 2 months earlier at age 24. Your vote yes on this bill means one of two things. Either you believe that trans children do not exist, or you believe that trans children do not deserve to exist. Exactly. Exactly. And like I said, I would add a third option. You think that you are actually helping mentally ill children, as opposed to, this falls under trans children do not exist. You're so convinced that trans kids are just having a phase or whatever bullshit you tell yourself, that you think you're helping. Now, let's pretend that this is a mental illness and that this is a phase. When children are little and they're playing make-believe, what do? Do you quash their make-believe friends? Or do you play along? Maybe not to an excessive degree, but you play along, right? If you're a good parent, you play along. You do not, if you're a good parent, you do not quash their imagination. Or if you do, you suck as a parent. Same thing here. Even if you were to think that this is a phase, what is the harm in social transition? I think I'm a boy, so I'm going to use pronouns he, him. I'm going to use the bathroom assigned to my gender as opposed to my biological sex. What harm are you causing by letting them do that? Now, is there a chance that they might get attacked in the bathroom? Absolutely. But that has nothing to do with them being trans and the fact that they are surrounded by asshats. So, let's move on. The anti-trans bill in Kentucky passed. At least 26 other states now have similar laws on the books. As these laws were being enacted, there was already a lot of research showing a strong association between anti-transgender policies and negative mental health outcomes, explains Ronita Nath. She runs research at the Trevor Project, which offers 24/7 crisis services for LGBTQ plus youth. Now, when we're talking about mental health, we are not talking about mental illness. Because Everyone has mental health challenges at some point or another. Now, some might be more willing to get help for such challenges. Some are more of the type of, I'm going to push through on my own. But we all experience mental health challenges. And so this has absolutely nothing to do with being mentally ill. It has everything to do with sometimes people need a little extra help to get through a crisis. Whether it be my parent has cancer or a loved one has cancer, whether it be that a loved one has died, or that you're just dealing with a lot on your plate and you need to talk to someone outside of that situation. Whatever it is, we all have times when we could use someone to talk to. So, yeah. Lawmakers and supporters of these laws argued that the evidence of negative mental health effects was weak, she says. So we clearly knew we needed to very firmly establish causality, and that's why we really prioritize this research, she explains. And like I said, I wonder how many of these people are going to be persuaded by this data, simply because it's not so much that the causality is weak. It's the fact that they don't want to accept that they are doing something harmful to another person. Because unless you are a psychopath, you generally don't want to hurt other people. So the idea that you're actually harming people, most people don't want to hear that. So if you truly care about people as opposed to your ideas of how people should be, then this study will persuade you. But if you're more concerned about your beliefs, then obviously no amount of evidence is going to change your mind. You're going to insist that you're right and that you never harmed anyone with your rhetoric, with your with these policies, because you just can't accept that you might actually be the problem. Because you can't accept that you're actually the bad guy. All right. To do that, they gathered data from transgender and non-binary young people aged 13 to 24 from all over the country. We do social media ads, says Nath. Once we reach our sample size in California or New York, we shut those ads down and we amplify the ads in these harder-to-reach states, let's say Wyoming or Idaho. Then Nath and her colleagues used a sample of 61,240 young people surveyed from 2018 to 2022, a period during which 19 states passed a variety of anti-trans laws. They looked to see how the rate of attempted suicides in the previous year changed for residents of those states after the laws were passed. We found a very sharp and statistically significant rise in suicide attempts rates after enactment of the laws, she says. A small rise was seen in a state soon after laws were enacted, followed by a sharper rise 2 or 3 years later. Among 13 to 17-year-olds, 2 years after a law took effect, the likelihood of a past year's suicide attempt was 72% higher than it was before passage. Because of course, I mean, if you happen to be trans and you have absolutely no way of transitioning in any way, whether it just be socially or medically, because this is dealing with teenagers, so most of it is social, if you're not able to get that care and get that affirmation that there's nothing wrong with you, that you're just trans and we're going to help you get through it, then of course you're going to think of suicide because you're going to be suffocating in your life because you cannot find an outlet for your feelings, for the knowledge that you have that you are not who people think you are. And you don't have the outlet to express yourself properly. So, Nath notes a randomized controlled trial would not be possible for this kind of research, since you can't randomly assign someone to live in one state or another. Instead, they analyzed the survey data for each state over time, comparing rates before and after laws were passed. The analysis took months, she said, and controlled for a variety of potentially confounding factors in order to isolate the impact of these laws on past years' suicide attempts. To see these numbers after everything was taken into account and the model still held, it's terrifying, she says. This study is the first of its kind, Nath adds. These findings demonstrate that regardless of a person's political beliefs, if you live in a state that has passed an anti-transgender law, transgender, non-binary young people in your home state are significantly more likely to attempt to take their own life, she says. This is the reality for these young people, and it's not acceptable. Associate Professor Brittany Charlton of Harvard Medical School, who wasn't involved with the study, finds it impressive. This study is just so important, she says. It's contributing to the growing body of evidence that demonstrates that these discriminatory anti-LGBTQ policies have harmful effects on health. It does so convincingly, she says, with a large sample size and strong research methods. And again, going back to what was it Kentucky legislature said, this will convince those who don't want to believe that trans people exist. This is showing that trans people do indeed exist. The people who don't want them to exist, this is not going to make any dent because they've already made their decision about trans people, and they obviously do not care if they are the monsters who are killing off trans people, because in their minds that's a good thing. So Nath adds that none of this is inevitable. Trans and non-binary young people are not inherently prone to increased suicide risk because of their gender identity, she says. They are placed at higher risk because of how they're mistreated and stigmatized by others, including by the implementation of discriminatory policies like the ones examined in the study. And again, this affects not just people who are trans, not people who are just non-binary, but people who don't follow gender stereotypes. I mentioned the long hair. Hell, the fact that people assume that I'm trans simply because I'm an ally just shows you that people can't accept that trans people exist, and they can't accept that there are cis people who don't think like them. If you accept that trans people exist and want to help them, or if you don't conform to one's idea of how a gender should go. Like Candace Owen thinking that women shouldn't wear pants, which is odd considering she wears pants all the freaking time. Or that men shouldn't have long hair, or they shouldn't wear skirts. I wonder what they think of the Scottish. So, because someone has this rigid idea of what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, anybody who doesn't conform 100% to that is subject to ridicule. There are women with low voices. There are women who sound like men. That doesn't mean that they're trans. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with them that you should mock or that you should attack for. There are men with high voices. Look up Vince Gill. The man has a high voice. Not just a singing voice. He has a high talking voice. Because he is a tenor. That does not mean that he's trans. That does not mean that there's anything wrong with his voice. It just means that that's his voice. So, yeah. This doesn't just affect trans people, but it affects people who aren't trans or non-binary as well. So maybe that will be enough to get people to stop stigmatizing trans people. Because once you start doing that, you are stigmatizing anyone who you believe doesn't conform to your idea of what a man or a woman should look like or sound like. And that is just messed up because people are people. I haven't worn skirts ever since I left Chicago Heights. I did wear skirts on occasionally to work. Now I don't wear them at all. Because I'm just more comfortable in pants. So, I just don't know what to tell you guys. That doesn't make me any less of a woman just because I'm always in pants. It doesn't make a man less of a man if he wears skirts. Because once upon a time, skirts were made for men. They were made for men because... And there have been studies about the effect of wearing tight clothing on men and their sperm count. There have been studies done on that. So, yeah, skirts were initially made for men. And that's what makes us even dumber, is that the things we associate with one gender or another, it used to be swapped. Pink used to be for boys. So I just don't know what else to tell you to convince you that going after trans people and having anti-trans rhetoric is dumb. Because if you still hate trans people, at least accept that this affects cis people as well. And the fact that I have to even do that is shitty. Because you should care about trans people because they're people. Not because they're mentally ill or whatever other reason. But just simply because they are people who should be given your compassion. Simply because they're going through a tough time. And why would you think, let's make these people's lives tougher? I just don't get it. Anyway, she says future research will explore data from 2023, which saw the largest number of anti-trans state bills to date. And then it ends with, if you or someone you know may be considering suicide or is in crisis, call or text 988 to reach the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. And that, of course, is for anybody. Doesn't just have to be for members of the LGBT plus community. It's for anyone who's in a crisis. Because, again, it's not just trans people who have a crisis situation which might lead to suicide. Anybody can have that crisis. Which makes this even more messed up that we're taking a vulnerable population and making their lives, which they're already having to come to terms with the fact that they aren't the gender that matches their biological sex, but we're making it harder for them in states where they come to this realization and they need help processing it and getting through that to the other side, and being told that they somehow don't actually exist or shouldn't be allowed to exist. So yeah. I believe that is all I have for this video. And with that, I will see you guys in the next one.